In the first decades of the 21st century, Venezuela possessed the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. On paper, that single fact should have guaranteed prosperity for generations. Instead, within barely 10 years, the country erased close to 80% of its economy. This collapse did not arrive with a foreign invasion, a civil war, or a natural disaster. It unfolded in peacetime, driven by policy decisions, economic incentives, and the quiet erosion of institutions. By the late years of the 21st century's second decade, prices were no longer stable from month to month, or even from day to day. They changed by the hour. Wages lost value before workers could spend them. Hospitals struggled to keep essential machines running. Millions of citizens chose exile, walking across borders not in search of opportunity, but in search of survival. How does a country so rich in natural resources end up unable to feed its people or keep the lights on? How does abundance transform into scarcity on such a scale? To understand that outcome, the story must move backward, away from the visible collapse, and toward the economic structure that quietly turned wealth into a trap long before the consequences became impossible to ignore. To understand why Venezuela collapsed so completely, it is necessary to step away from the images of empty shelves and mass migration and examine the economic structure that existed long before the crisis became visible. For much of the late 20th century and the early years of the 21st century, Venezuela was not a poor country. It was a country that became extraordinarily wealthy in one narrow and dangerous way. Oil shaped nearly every part of the national economy. It dominated exports, public revenue, and access to foreign currency. When global oil prices were high, money flowed into the state with remarkable ease. The government did not need to build a broad tax base or nurture a competitive private sector. Oil revenue appeared to solve every problem at once. Imports became cheap, consumption expanded, social spending increased rapidly. To many citizens, prosperity felt permanent. This dynamic created a powerful illusion of stability. Economists describe this pattern as Dutch disease. When a country earns large amounts of foreign currency from a single natural resource, its domestic currency strengthens. Imported goods become cheaper than locally produced ones. Farming and manufacturing lose competitiveness. Over time, production withers, not because people stop working, but because the economic incentives no longer reward it. In Venezuela, this process unfolded gradually but relentlessly. Domestic agriculture declined as imported food filled supermarkets. Manufacturing shrank as foreign products replaced local output. The economy became highly dependent on imports paid for by oil dollars. What looked like abundance was in fact a growing vulnerability. The country consumed far more than it produced, and oil income quietly filled the gap. At the center of this system stood the state oil company. It was not just an energy producer, it became the financial heart of the nation. Oil revenue paid public salaries, funded subsidies, supported social programs, and sustained political loyalty. As long as oil prices remained high, the system appeared functional. Few questioned what would happen if that flow slowed or stopped. Political decisions reinforced this fragility. Rather than saving surplus revenue during boom years, spending expanded. Instead of investing in diversified industries, power and resources were concentrated in state institutions tied directly to oil income. Economic management became increasingly centralized, and technical decision-making gave way to political priorities. Productivity mattered less than control. This context is critical. Venezuela did not collapse simply because oil prices fell or inflation rose. Those were symptoms, not causes. The deeper problem was an economy built around a single source of income, combined with institutions too weak to adapt when conditions changed. When oil revenue faltered, there were no strong alternative industries, no resilient tax system, and no independent institutions capable of absorbing the shock. With the foundation already cracked, the country was now exposed. The next stage of the story shows how specific decisions transformed structural weakness into full-scale disaster, beginning with the slow destruction of the oil sector itself. When Venezuela's collapse accelerated, it was often explained as the result of external pressure or sudden shocks. Falling oil prices, sanctions, political confrontation. Yet none of these forces alone can explain why the economy disintegrated so completely. The first and most decisive cause was internal and long in the making. It was the gradual destruction of the country's only functioning economic engine and the institutions meant to protect it. For years, oil insulated the state from difficult choices. Revenue arrived without the need for efficiency, diversification, or accountability. As a result, institutional discipline weakened. Technical expertise lost priority. The National Oil Company was no longer treated as a complex industrial organization that required constant reinvestment and professional management. It became a fiscal reservoir, tapped whenever the government needed cash. This shift became irreversible during the early years of the 21st century. After a prolonged strike within the oil sector, tens of thousands of experienced engineers, geologists, and technicians were dismissed from the state oil company. Their removal was not based on performance, but on political alignment. In the short term, production continued and exports flowed. On the surface, nothing appeared broken. Beneath that surface, however, institutional capacity was being hollowed out. Oil extraction is not a simple activity. It depends on continuous maintenance, specialized knowledge, and long-term planning. Once technical expertise is removed, infrastructure begins to decay quietly. Refineries operate below capacity. Pipelines corrode. Drilling equipment ages without replacement. These failures do not cause immediate collapse. They reduce output slowly, year by year, until recovery becomes extremely difficult. As oil prices surged during the first decade of the new millennium, these weaknesses were masked. High prices compensated for falling efficiency. Revenue remained strong enough to fund expanding public spending. This created a dangerous illusion that the system was still healthy. In reality, Venezuela was consuming its productive capacity to sustain short-term stability. When oil prices began to fall during the middle years of the 21st century's second decade, the illusion vanished. Production could not be increased to offset lower prices. Costs were high. Infrastructure was degraded. Output declined sharply. Export earnings collapsed. The country discovered that it no longer possessed the operational ability to fully exploit the resource on which its entire economy depended. The consequences were immediate and severe. Hard currency inflows dried up. Imports became difficult to finance. The state struggled to pay its obligations, maintain public services, or stabilize the currency. What had once looked like a temporary downturn revealed itself as structural failure. At this stage, a country with strong institutions might have adjusted. Spending could have been reduced, investment redirected, production rebuilt over time. Venezuela no longer had that option. Institutional decay had removed the mechanisms needed for correction. With no alternative industries and no technical base capable of rapid recovery, the state turned to the only remaining lever fully under its control. That lever was the creation of money. In the next chapter, this decision will transform an economic crisis into a monetary catastrophe, as inflation destroys trust itself and accelerates the collapse beyond repair. Once oil revenue collapsed and hard currency inflows dried up, the Venezuelan state faced a brutal arithmetic. Public salaries still had to be paid. Subsidies still had to be funded. Debt obligations still existed. Cutting spending on a meaningful scale would have required political concessions and institutional discipline that no longer existed. Raising taxes was impossible in an economy already shrinking. With production falling and revenue evaporating, the government turned to the one instrument it fully controlled. It ordered the central bank to create money. At first, this decision appeared painless. New currency allowed the state to cover immediate expenses. Public workers were paid. Social programs continued. On paper, the system still functioned, but money creation does not generate real resources. It merely redistributes value. When currency supply expands faster than goods and services, prices rise. When this process accelerates, distrust collapses. Inflation had already been a problem before the crisis intensified. In the years preceding the oil price collapse, consumer prices were rising at uncomfortable but manageable rates. Once money creation became the primary tool of fiscal survival, inflation turned into something far more dangerous. Prices began to rise not by the year or the month, but by the week, then by the day. As inflation accelerated, expectations changed. Businesses no longer set prices based on costs or demand. They set prices based on how quickly money was losing value. Workers no longer saved wages. They spent them immediately, buying any tangible good that might hold value longer than cash. Money ceased to function as a store of value, then as a unit of account, and finally as a medium of exchange. This was the tipping point. Hyperinflation is not merely high inflation. It is a psychological collapse. Once people stop trusting currency, every transaction becomes a race against time. Restaurants stopped printing menus because prices changed too quickly. Shopkeepers removed goods from shelves rather than sell at prices that could not be restocked. Informal barter reappeared. Dollars, euros, and even commodities replaced the national currency in daily life. Government response worsened the damage. Rather than restoring confidence, authorities imposed price controls and accused businesses of speculation. Military units were sent to enforce lower prices by decree. In theory, this was meant to protect consumers. In practice, it destroyed supply. A shop forced to sell below replacement cost could not restock. Shelves emptied. Scarcity spread. At this stage, inflation was no longer the core problem. Trust was. An economy functions on belief. Belief that money received today will still have value tomorrow. Belief that contracts will be honored. Belief that selling goods will allow future production. Hyperinflation burned that belief to the ground. The consequences extended far beyond prices. Savings accumulated over a lifetime vanished. Pensions became worthless. Professional salaries fell to levels insufficient for basic survival. Doctors, engineers, and teachers found that their skills no longer protected them from poverty. Human capital began to flee. Money creation had solved a short-term political problem, but it had destroyed the social contract. With currency no longer usable and markets no longer functioning, the economy shifted from monetary crisis to humanitarian crisis. And when money dies, hunger follows. In the next chapter, the story moves from inflation charts to empty plates, as scarcity becomes a tool of control and survival turns into a daily struggle for millions. When currency loses meaning and markets stop functioning, scarcity becomes unavoidable. In Venezuela, the economic crisis crossed a critical threshold when inflation and price controls collided with a collapse in imports. Food did not disappear because the land stopped producing or because the population suddenly grew. It disappeared because the systems that moved goods from producers to consumers no longer worked. Supermarket shelves emptied first. Imports slowed as hard currency vanished. Domestic agriculture, weakened for years by dependence on foreign food, could not fill the gap. What began as inconvenience turned into chronic shortage. By the middle years of the 21st century's second decade, access to basic food was no longer determined by income alone, but by proximity, connections, and political loyalty. In this environment, hunger became a social fact. Surveys conducted by Venezuelan universities revealed widespread weight loss across the population, not due to changes in lifestyle, but due to skipped meals. Families adjusted by reducing portion sizes, eliminating protein, and eating fewer times per day. Malnutrition spread quietly, first among the poor, then among the working class, and eventually into professions once considered secure. The state responded with food distribution programs designed to alleviate shortages. In practice, these programs evolved into instruments of control. Subsidized food packages were delivered selectively. Households that supported the government received them regularly. Those that protested or lived in opposition neighborhoods often did not. Food was no longer just nutrition. It became leverage. This transformation had profound consequences. Political participation declined not because people stopped caring, but because survival took priority over dissent. Hunger drains energy, attention, and risk tolerance. A population focused on securing its next meal cannot sustain organized resistance. Economic collapse achieved what repression alone could not. As conditions worsened, people began to leave. At first, migration was gradual. Professionals sought opportunities abroad. Students left to continue their education. Over time, departure turned into flight. Entire families walked across borders carrying what little they owned. The scale was unprecedented. Millions exited the country within a few years, creating the largest displacement crisis in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere. This exodus carried a hidden cost. Those most capable of rebuilding an economy were the first to go. Doctors left hospitals that no longer paid livable wages. Engineers departed industries that no longer functioned. Teachers abandoned classrooms where salaries could not cover transportation. The country lost not only population, but capacity. Human capital is not easily replaced. Training a surgeon or an electrical engineer takes years. When those skills leave en masse, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Infrastructure failures go unfixed. Production cannot restart. Institutions hollow out further. Each departure makes the next more likely. Migration also reshaped the economy itself. Remittances sent from abroad became a critical source of survival for those who remained. Small transfers kept families afloat, but they also masked deeper dysfunction. Instead of earning income through domestic production, households survived on money generated elsewhere. The economy continued to shrink even as daily life became dependent on external lifelines. By this point, the crisis was no longer abstract. It was visible in bodies, classrooms, and hospitals. The collapse of money had led to hunger. Hunger had led to migration. Migration had stripped the country of the very people needed to reverse the decline. And as the population thinned and institutions weakened, the physical systems that supported daily life began to fail as well. In the next chapter, the story turns to the moment when the lights went out and economic collapse became a direct threat to life itself. Economic collapse does not stop at prices and wages. When institutions weaken and skilled labor disappears, physical systems begin to fail. In Venezuela, the deterioration of infrastructure transformed a prolonged crisis into an immediate danger to life. Electricity, water, transportation, and healthcare systems that once functioned under strain began to break down entirely. The most visible moment came during the nationwide blackout in the later years of the 21st century's second decade. Large parts of the country lost power not for hours, but for days. In some regions, outages stretched close to a week. Traffic lights stopped working, mobile networks collapsed, refrigeration failed, food spoiled, daily routines disintegrated. Electricity generation had long depended on a small number of aging facilities that required constant maintenance. Years of underinvestment, corruption, and the departure of technical staff left these systems fragile. When failure occurred, there were few engineers left with the expertise to respond quickly. Repairs were improvised. Equipment was cannibalized from other sites. Temporary fixes replaced long-term solutions. The consequences reached far beyond inconvenience. Water pumps failed when electricity stopped. In a tropical climate, access to clean water became a daily struggle. Households collected water from polluted rivers and improvised sources. Sanitation deteriorated. Public health risks multiplied quietly. Hospitals were hit hardest. Backup generators failed due to lack of fuel, spare parts, or maintenance. Life-saving equipment stopped functioning. Doctors were forced to make impossible decisions with limited resources. Treatments that had once been routine became unavailable. In these moments, economic collapse ceased to be a matter of statistics. It became a matter of survival. As formal systems failed, informal ones expanded. With the national currency no longer trusted and banks barely functioning, daily transactions shifted to cash in foreign currency, barter, or informal credit. Markets reappeared outside official channels. Dollars circulated openly, even as official rhetoric continued to condemn their use. This informal survival economy created stark inequality. Those with access to foreign currency, often through remittances or connections, could purchase imported goods in private stores. Those without such access relied on irregular state assistance or informal networks. Society fractured into parallel realities, living side by side but governed by different rules. For the government, this informality became a means of survival. By tolerating dollar transactions and informal markets, authorities reduced pressure on the state to provide functioning services. The appearance of activity replaced genuine recovery. Economic life continued, but outside institutions, outside regulation, and outside long-term planning. This adaptation masked the depth of the collapse. Life did not stop. People adjusted, they improvised, but every adjustment came at the cost of future recovery. Infrastructure continued to decay. Skills continued to leave. Informality replaced productivity. By the time the country reached this stage, collapse was no longer sudden or dramatic. It was normalized. The economy had not recovered. It had changed shape. It had learned to survive without functioning institutions, without reliable services, and without a stable currency. The next phase of the story examines what this meant in an international context and why Venezuela's experience stands out when compared with other resource-rich nations. Venezuela's collapse invites an obvious question. Other countries possess vast natural resources. Other nations have faced falling commodity prices, political polarization, and external pressure. Why did Venezuela fall so much further than its peers? The answer lies not in oil itself, but in how institutions, incentives, and policy choices interacted over time. A comparison with other resource-rich economies makes this contrast clear. Norway also built its modern wealth on oil. Yet Norway treated oil income as temporary and volatile. Revenues were saved through a sovereign wealth fund. Spending was restrained. Institutions remained independent from political cycles. When oil prices fell, the economy slowed, but it did not break. The difference was not geology, it was governance. Even within Latin America, Venezuela's trajectory stands out. Countries such as Colombia and Brazil experienced commodity booms and busts without erasing their productive capacity. They maintained diversified export bases and functioning monetary systems. Inflation rose at times, but it did not destroy trust in currency. Political conflict existed, but economic institutions retained enough credibility to prevent total collapse. The United States offers another contrast. When financial crisis struck during the first decade of the 21st century, the economy contracted sharply, yet institutions responded by stabilizing banks, preserving payment systems, and restoring confidence. Growth eventually resumed. Output expanded dramatically over the following years. The key difference was the ability to absorb shocks without dismantling the foundations of economic life. By contrast, Venezuela experienced a peacetime contraction comparable to wartime devastation. Over the course of a single decade, national output shrank by roughly 3/4. Poverty became nearly universal. A quarter of the population left the country. These outcomes were not inevitable consequences of external pressure. They were the cumulative result of internal decisions that amplified every shock, instead of cushioning it. The social consequences were profound. High inflation destroyed savings and pensions, erasing decades of accumulated effort. Migration separated families and hollowed out communities. Inequality deepened as access to foreign currency determined survival. Trust in institutions collapsed alongside trust in money. When belief disappears, rebuilding becomes far harder than managing a temporary recession. Politically, the collapse altered incentives at every level. The state relied increasingly on informal revenue sources and tolerated parallel economies. Short-term survival replaced long-term planning. Accountability weakened further as institutions lost relevance. Economic dysfunction fed political instability, and political instability discouraged investment, locking the country into a self-reinforcing cycle. Internationally, Venezuela became a warning rather than a model. Investors withdrew, trading partners limited exposure, regional neighbors absorbed millions of migrants, reshaping labor markets and social systems across borders. The crisis ceased to be national. It became regional. The broader lesson extends beyond Venezuela. Resource wealth does not guarantee stability. High spending does not ensure welfare. Control does not substitute for capacity. When institutions fail, abundance accelerates collapse rather than preventing it. The next question is unavoidable. If the damage was so severe, was recovery ever possible? And if so, what would it have required before the collapse hardened into permanence? At several points along this path, Venezuela still had options. Collapse was not preordained. It became inevitable only after repeated decisions closed off alternatives one by one. Understanding what could have worked is essential, not to rewrite history, but to clarify the conditions required for recovery in any similar crisis. The first requirement would have been restoring institutional credibility. No economy can function without trust in its monetary authority, legal system, and basic rules of exchange. Stabilizing the currency would have required an immediate end to uncontrolled money creation, paired with credible fiscal reform. That means aligning public spending with real revenue, even when the political cost is high. Without that anchor, inflation control is impossible. Second, rebuilding the productive base would have been critical. Oil alone could not sustain the economy, but it remained the fastest potential source of hard currency. That would have required reinvesting in infrastructure, restoring technical expertise, and insulating operational decisions from political interference. Skilled professionals do not return to systems where competence is secondary to loyalty. Rebuilding capacity would have depended on guarantees of autonomy and safety. Third, diversification was not optional. Agriculture and light manufacturing could not recover overnight, but targeted incentives could have slowed dependence on imports. Stable exchange rates, access to inputs, and predictable regulations matter more than subsidies. Countries that escape resource traps do so by rewarding production rather than consumption. Social policy would also have required restructuring. Broad subsidies funded by monetary expansion offer short-term relief but long-term destruction. Targeted assistance tied to transparent budgets would have reduced pressure on the currency while protecting the most vulnerable. Food security depends on logistics and incentives, not distribution alone. Finally, recovery would have required addressing the human capital drain. Professionals rarely return unless living standards, security, and opportunity improve together. That process takes years. Without people, infrastructure remains broken. Without infrastructure, people do not return. Breaking that cycle demands credible reform signals sustained over time. The future scenarios diverge sharply. In a reform path, institutional rebuilding gradually restores confidence. Production stabilizes. Migration slows. Growth resumes from a very low base. This path is slow, fragile, and politically difficult, but it exists. In the alternative path, reform remains partial or cosmetic. Informality persists. External lifelines substitute for domestic production. The economy survives without truly recovering. In this scenario, collapse does not deepen dramatically, but neither does it reverse. Scarcity becomes normalized. The lesson is not that recovery is impossible. It is that delay raises the cost. Each year of institutional decay compounds future difficulty. Each professional who leaves reduces the speed of rebuilding. Time itself becomes an enemy. This brings the story to its final point. What remains after collapse is not just damaged infrastructure or empty accounts, but a fundamental lesson about incentives and outcomes. Venezuela's collapse was not the result of a single bad year or one external enemy. It was the cumulative outcome of incentives that rewarded consumption over production, loyalty over competence, and control over capacity. Oil wealth did not save the country. It delayed reform and magnified failure. When the flow of easy money slowed, there were no resilient institutions left to absorb the shock. The most painful lesson is that economic disasters of this scale are rarely sudden. They are built quietly, decision by decision, long before the consequences are visible. Money creation can postpone reckoning, but it cannot create prosperity. Price controls can hide scarcity, but they cannot produce goods. Informal survival can keep life moving, but it cannot rebuild a nation. There is a simple principle that explains the entire arc. Incentives shape behavior. When systems reward extraction instead of production, decay follows. When trust is destroyed, recovery becomes exponentially harder. This is not a story about ideology alone. It is a story about institutional reality. For viewers watching from outside Venezuela, the relevance is immediate. Resource wealth, fiscal expansion, and political promises exist everywhere. The difference lies in whether institutions are strong enough to enforce limits and preserve trust. The warning is clear. No country is immune to economic gravity. Understanding these patterns is not an academic exercise. It is the first step toward avoiding them. If this analysis helped clarify how economies collapse and why recovery is so difficult, consider sharing it with others who care about policy, incentives, and long-term stability. Subscribe for deeper examinations of how money, power, and institutions shape everyday life. Because economics is never just about numbers. It is about the systems people depend on and what happens when those systems fail.